Hello and welcome to the third of 4 events, which is organised jointly by the Nottingham Irish Studies Group and 5 Leaves, which is Nottingham's Irish, independent bookshop. We're not charging for these sessions, but we ask you to think about making a small contribution, if you can, to Emmanuel House, which works with homeless people in Nottingham and especially at this time could certainly do with some support. So tonight I'm going to start with a short description of the period from the Easter Rising to the Civil War, what is sometimes called the Revolutionary Years. And then Deirdre O'Byrne will talk about the writers and writing from the period. So the 6 years between 1916 and 1922 were the most tumultuous and important in modern Irish history. Ireland got its independence by 1922, and it was an independence that most people supported, but there was a significant minority in the country that thought it was a betrayal. And it's worth remembering that before 1916, before the Easter Rising, the majority of people in Ireland supported Home Rule and didn't support breaking away from the United Kingdom, and certainly didn't support a violent rebellion. And this is what happened in Easter week 1916, when 1,200 rebels from the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army took over the centre of Dublin and declared independence from the United Kingdom and raised the tricolour. The rising had been planned. Next slide, Simon, please. The rising had been planned by this man, Tom Clark, a leader of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was a very small secret society dedicated to overthrowing the British rule in Ireland. And Clark planned the Easter Rising with members of the IRB above the small tobacconist shop that he ran in Parnell Street, just around the corner from the General Post Office in Dublin. And in September 1914, the IRB met and decided to stage a rising on the old adage that England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. And like all previous rebellions, the Easter Rising was poorly planned, it was confused, and there was little communication between the different parties. A shipload of German guns, 25,000 rifles, was expected to land from a German ship off the southern coast of Ireland. The British knew about this and intercepted it, and the German captain scuttled the ship. Next slide, Simon, please. The Irish Volunteers, the main group which was supposed to take part in the rising, the vast majority of them didn't know anything about it. They knew nothing about the rising. And the leader, the commander-in-chief of the Irish Volunteers, Owen MacNeill, knew nothing about it. And when he heard about it, tried to cancel it by putting notices in the press. I think it's the first time in history, probably, that anyone has ever tried to cancel a revolution by putting advertisements in the newspaper. And very few of the rebels had any military experience, but several of them were intellectuals, writers, poets, and it's sometimes called the Poets' Rising. And they knew the importance of symbolism and political theatre. Their objective was to shock the Irish people out of what they saw as their complacency and to galvanise Irish-American opinion. And in 1916, there was a presidential election going on in America. So they wanted this to become part of the agenda in America. The rising at Easter also had big significance for a very religious country like Ireland. Patrick Pearse, the leader of the rising, a man who was obsessed with martyrdom and blood sacrifice, said, "One man can free a people as one man can redeem the world." Next slide, 7, please. And on Easter Monday, the rebels took over the General Post Office and several other buildings around the centre of Dublin. And the tricolour was hoisted over the GPO, and Pearse read out the proclamation of the Irish Republic. And it was predictably, faced with the might of the British Army, the rising was over in days. Next slide, please. The British Army brought up field artillery on the Tuesday, the following day after the rising started, and began to shell the rebel positions. And in the course of doing so, destroyed most of the centre of Dublin and killed about 250 people. By Friday, next slide, please. By Friday, the GPO was in flames, and by Saturday, Pearse had ordered surrender. And the rebels were rounded up, and 95 were sentenced to death. In the end, only 15 were executed, the 7 leaders, and 8 others were executed. But just as Pearse had predicted, next slide, please, the 7 leaders of the rising quickly became martyrs, and public opinion began to swing very quickly behind the rebels and away from the British authorities. And the British government very quickly realised a mistake, and they stopped the executions, and they released a lot of the younger prisoners. The rising was sometimes called the most successful failure in Irish history, because it did what the rebels had said. The symbolism of this, the shedding of martyrs' blood, did what they had thought. And it spelt the end of constitutional nationalism of the Irish Parliamentary Party. Now, there have been some songs over the years about 1916. I think one of the best is the Foggy Dew, and certainly the best rendition of that, I think, is Sinead O'Connor and the Chieftains. So over the next 2 years, the political and military situation in Ireland changed completely. Lots of the prisoners were released at the end of 1916. And the future leaders of the political and military war of independence were amongst them, people like Michael Collins, of course. Sinn Fein, the Young Republicans that were released immediately took over Sinn Fein and quickly established it into a national organisation. Before 1916, it had been practically defunct, but it quickly became a very vibrant national organisation with thousands of members. And to give you an idea of how successful it was, between January and August 1917, the Irish Parliamentary Party, the biggest nationalist party in Ireland, lost 4 by-elections to Sinn Fein. One of them in South Longford was, the candidate was Joe McGuinness, Sinn Fein candidate. McGuinness was in prison in England at the time for his part in the rising, and was elected with a very catchy slogan: "Put him in to get him out, put him into Parliament to get him out of prison." He won that by-election, by the way. And in October 1917, the Sinn Fein and the Irish Volunteers effectively merged as one organisation, the political and military wing of the Republican movement. The Catholic Church, which had been very much against the Easter Rising, weighed in with support behind Sinn Fein, although it stopped short of supporting the Irish Volunteers and and a violent rebellion. And in April 1918, next slide, please. In April 1918, the government did one of the periodic things which it sometimes did to increase support for the Republicans. It attempted to impose conscription on Ireland. And Ireland had always been very ambivalent about the war. And attempting to impose conscription brought the whole of nationalist Ireland together and greatly boosted Sinn Fein. Next slide, please. By December 1918, at the time of the general election, once the war had finished, Sinn Fein was in a very dominant position and secured an overwhelming majority in the general election. It won 73 of 105 seats in Ireland. 47 of the MPs that were elected were still in prison. And the Irish Parliamentary Party, the biggest nationalist party since the 1870s, was almost completely wiped out. It was left with 7 seats. And in January 1919, next slide, please. The first Dáil or Parliament was convened in the Mansion House in Dublin, and a government was elected, a provisional government. Countess Markievicz was the Minister for Labour, Michael Collins, the Minister for Finance. And when De Valera was escaped from Lincoln Prison in April of that year, he was elected President of the Republic. The British government put up with this for a few months, and in September 1919, banned the Dáil and the Irish government. It also banned Sinn Fein, and it also banned the IRA. The Irish Volunteers had now been renamed the IRA, the Army of the Irish Republic. And in 1920, the IRA launched a full-scale campaign against British rule in Ireland. And in response to this, Lloyd George recruited a force, a special force in Britain to combat the IRA. Next slide, please. Who were immediately christened the Black and Tans because of their uniform, tan trousers and black jackets. The Black and Tans quickly developed a reputation for ill discipline and execution and torture of Irish prisoners. IRA prisoners was common. Burnings of people's homes and reprisals against local communities also became commonplace. Next slide, please. And on the 11th of December 1920, in reprisal for an IRA ambush, the Black and Tans set fire to the centre of Cork City, including the City Hall. And when the fire brigade attempted to put out the fires, they cut the fire hoses. And you have to remember that Ireland at that time was still a part of the United Kingdom. And yet you had these so-called forces of the Crown, forces of law and order, who were acting like gangs of brigands wandering the countryside, shooting and killing and burning and looting. And the Black and Tans, which was sanctioned by the British government, were an absolute disaster, public relations disaster for the government. They alienated moderate nationalist opinion and liberal opinion in Britain, and especially in America, where the Irish American community were galvanized by what was happening in Ireland. And in December 1920, the Government of Ireland Act was passed by the British Parliament. And this was the government's attempt to bring some kind of end to this. But again, it was too little too late. The Government of Ireland Act proposed to set up 2 parliaments, one in Dublin and one in Belfast. But by the end of 1920, nationalist opinion for Home Rule had faded completely, moved on. But the Unionists in Northern Ireland enthusiastically grasped the opportunity to set up a parliament in Belfast. And in a subsequent election, took 40 of the 52 seats in the first Northern Ireland Parliament. And from the start, it was a deeply undemocratic concept. 6 counties of Ulster had been picked to have an inbuilt unionist majority. And it was a time bomb waiting to go off, because from the start, Catholics were treated as second-class citizens. And it was done with the approval and the connivance of the British government. And the irony here, I think, is that the Ulster Unionists, who were so against Home Rule, were actually the only ones in the end who accepted it. By the middle of 1921, the IRA was struggling to keep its campaign going, running out of weapons and ammunition. And on the other side, it became obvious to Britain, to the British government, that Home Rule was now not going to be accepted in Ireland. And the Parliament in Belfast was in place. So a ceasefire was arranged in June 1921, and formal talks began in October and lasted until December to try and find some resolution to the war. De Valera, who, as President of the Republic, should have led the delegation to London, refused to go, and instead Michael Collins went. Next slide, please. And Collins led the delegation, and after 2 months of negotiation, a treaty was finally agreed. Next slide, please. And 26 counties of Ireland, to be called the Irish Free State, was proposed. The Free State would have full autonomy, full independence, but the MPs would have to swear an oath of allegiance to the Crown. The issue of Northern Ireland was kicked into the long grass again, and a boundary commission was set up, although it was obvious to everybody at that point that all the boundary commission would do would be look at the territorial limits of Northern Ireland, not at the entity itself. The delegation under Collins, under extreme pressure from Lloyd George and the government, agreed to the treaty. And crucially, without going back and getting De Valera's approval in Dublin, or the approval of the Irish government. And this proved to be a pretty costly mistake. The Dáil, De Valera immediately condemned the treaty. He said it was a betrayal. It went for approval to the Dáil, to the Irish Parliament in January 1922. And the Dáil passed it by 64 to 57, a very small majority. De Valera immediately led a walkout of his 57 MPs out of the Irish Parliament. Next slide, please. And in 1922, 16th of January 1922, Michael Collins accepted the handover from Britain. There's a story about the handover that Collins was 7 minutes late arriving for the handover. And the Viceroy, who was due to do the handover, said, "You've kept us waiting, Mr. Collins, for 7 minutes." And Collins replied, "Well, you've kept us waiting for 700 years. I think we can do it 7 minutes." I don't know whether that's true or not, but if it's not, it should be. In June 1922, a general election was held with the country on the brink of civil war. De Valera was still refusing to accept the treaty. The IRA had split down the middle, and the majority of them were against the treaty. So the election was effectively a referendum on the treaty. And pro-treaty parties won an overwhelming majority. The anti-treaty parties only took 21% of the vote. I think the reason for this is that most people were tired of war. They were traumatized by what had happened the previous year with the Black and Tans and the conflict between the IRA. And they didn't really care very much if their MPs had to swear an oath of allegiance to the king. And they also didn't care very much, I don't think, whether the state, the new state, was called the Irish Free State or the Irish Republic. Many supported the treaty because Collins supported it. Some said, what's good enough for Mick is good enough for me. And De Valera, who had a knack for coming up with catchy phrases, in his response said, the majority have no right to do wrong. The majority have no right to do wrong. It's a classic De Valera phrase, I think. And he was supported by a minority, a sizable minority, within Sinn Fein and the IRA. And predictably, I think hostilities between the two sides quickly broke out. When challenged that this was undemocratic, the anti-treaty side said, well, we didn't have a democratic mandate in 1916. In August, next slide, please. In August 1922, Michael Collins, who was Commander-in-Chief of the pro-treaty Free State forces, was killed in West Cork. And the members of the anti-treaty IRA who organised the ambush were former comrades and friends of his. And the civil war which followed claimed more lives than the Easter Rising and the War of Independence put together, although it's something that has been almost written out of the consciousness of Irish people for many years. And civil wars leave a lasting damage on societies, especially when the conflict is caused by splits in revolutionary movements, as happened in Ireland in 1922. The anti-treaty forces were defeated, and De Valera, who led the political part of the anti-treaty movement, seemed like a spent force. But within a few years, he was back at the head of a new party, Fianna Fáil, which took power in 1932. And the state that emerged after independence was a disappointment to many. And the Irish writer Dorothy McCardle noted that for every individual in the Republican movement, the Republic seemed the Ireland of his desire. In other words, the Republic, this ephemeral thing, meant very different things to very different people. For many nationalists, and probably the majority, the changes they looked for were primarily political. The chance for Irish people to run their own affairs. But for others, especially those on the left, they wanted more than a political revolution. They wanted a social revolution as well. And it's taken almost 100 years for us to get over the Civil War split and to be able to begin to talk seriously about the kind of society that Ireland should be. And we'll be talking some more about that next week. So I'm going to hand over to Deirdre now, who's going to talk about some of the writing and some of the writers associated with this period. Deirdre.
Right, I'm on. Thanks, Pat. If you have any questions, can you put them in the Q&A box down there, please? If you have any comments of general nature, put them in the chat, but we won't be keeping an eye on the chat, so questions we'll address at the end. First slide, Simon, please. Right. Here we've got, as you can see, the image, West Cork Flying Column, Anglo-Irish War. Well, it might be known to the rest of the world as the Anglo-Irish War, but for us it's known as the War of Independence. I did think this was a good symbol. We found it on Creative Commons, so it's in the public domain, as they say. But it's fuzzy. You can't really tell who these guys are. but the way these figures have been turned into kind of mythological heroes afterwards is what I'm concerned with today. So far in this series of talks, I've been looking at writings of the historical period. What I'm moving on today is starting with some writings at the time, but looking at how 1916, the War of Independence and the Civil War were mythologized afterwards. There is remarkably less mythologizing about the Civil War because it was so difficult, but certainly the birth of the nation became a kind of a myth in itself. As we were saying last week, the Irish, they're great storytellers. They're very interested in making a good story. The first mythologizer in the first slide, we were talking about Pearse the second slide, next slide, please, Simon. Patrick Pearse, we heard about him last week, and this is a poem I learned about 1966 and the 50th anniversary. And I was still a child at school. And it's about his mother. Allegedly, he wrote it the night before he was executed. And it's in the voice of his own mother, who did support her sons, Willie and Pádraig, in the Republican cause. But he's speaking in the voice here saying, his mother doesn't grudge them. But look at the language. My two strong sons that I've seen go out. On the fourth line there, in bloody protest for a glorious thing. And then he goes on to say, in her voice, they'll be spoken of among their people. The generations shall remember them and call them blessed. If you're brought up as Catholic, as I was, blessed is a name people use for saints. He's setting himself up as a sort of a Jesus figure here. And I've got a statue in there of Michelangelo's La Pieta. Again, we grew up with images, pictures, stories about Mary holding the dead body of her son. And this, I think, is Pearse drawing on that kind of myth making for his own heritage that he's foreseeing. And indeed, he was right that after his death, he was turned into a kind of a Christ-like figure. Some of you will remember those kind of triptychs they had on the wall of John F. Kennedy, the Pope, and Patrick Pearse. Sometimes the figures change, but Pearse was generally there with the Pope. Kind of laughable when we think about what we found out about John F. Kennedy afterwards. Right, next slide, please. The mythologizing went on. If you look at the words of the Foggy Jew, this is addressing the young men who chose to fight on the Irish side instead of going to fight in the World War, which is what Pearse and his cohort were saying. The fourth line there, well, the third and fourth, it was better to die neath an Irish sky than at Suvla or Soudal Bar. They were places in the Gallipoli campaign of World War I where Irish troops who had joined the British Army were killed. They said there were inadequate provisions and so on. But on the other side, they're talking about Suvla's waves and where Fenians sleep and so on. This was written by Canon O'Neill at the first sitting of the Dáil, that he was struck by the number of absentees, that when their names were called out, the answer was Fuiglas Ignagail, under luck by the stranger, in other words, by the British, by the foreigners. 34 people were absent of the Republicans because they were jailed. So this is mythologizing after the event, because this was produced after 1919 when this 32-year-old canon, this strikes me as terribly young to be a canon, but already the myth is starting. Right, next slide, please. We see, well, as Pat said, everything changed with Easter 1916. Even with Yeats, the Yeats we met last week was this young romantic that was still basically away with the fairies. This was the beginning of the politicizing of Yeats. In his poem September 1913, he's really cynical, what being you, or what need you being come to sense, and so on. But he's saying romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. He revised this because, great myth maker that he was himself, after 1916 on the right-hand side there, quite a long poem, both of these, but he has gone from saying in September 1913, they were of a different kind, the names that stilled your childish play, and, you know, saying they were gone. And now he says, I write it out in a verse, MacDonagh and MacBride, Connolly and Pearse. And he goes on, now and in time to be, again foreseeing that this myth making is going to go on wherever green is worn. And indeed, you know, that he sees it's going to go out into the Irish diaspora, that everything is changed. It's interesting to look at the word he uses there, utterly. Of course, utterly means changed completely, but to utter is also to speak. And it is the case that a lot of the uttering, the speaking and the writing about 1916, it's become a creation made out of words as much as the deeds, if you like. Right, next slide. Great friends of Yeats, the women. So what were the women saying? This is Eva Gore Booth. I just looked up the date of the great play we saw last year in Nottingham. It was put on by Links Theatre, and thanks to our friend Stuart Halferty, it was put on in Nonsuch, Nottingham. It was the story of these two Gore Booth sisters, Eva and Constance. Con Markovich, well, that was her married name, were very involved in the nationalist cause. This is Eva Gore Booth writing about Roger Casement. Again, the language is interesting. The second line there, I dream of him bringing hope to the hopeless. I dream of him bringing light to the blind. This is using the language of religion again. That this is the language of Christ, bringing light to the blind. Christ was the light of the world. And this dreaming, I dream of the death that he died for the sake of God and Kathleen Houlihan. I said Kathleen Houlihan's kind of personification of Ireland. You see, every time they write it, they spell it differently. None of them are too sure about the Irish spelling. So God and religion are tied up with patriotism. The Irish people were not the only ones doing this. If any of you studied the World War I poets or any of the writings of what was going on in England and indeed in Britain at the time, the young men were being urged to do their duty for God and the crown. And some of the World War I poets that we now read, like Wilfred Owen and Secret Sassoon, were saying, well, you know, that's not the case. It was just slaughter. There was nothing glorious about it at all. The other interesting thing about this is just a snippet from the poem. She says, yea, for love and the voice on the wind. The wind is capitalized there. The wind became a kind of a symbol. You'll know, I'm sure, Ken Loach's great film, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, which is based on a poem of the same name. The wind that shakes the barley became a kind of a symbol, harking back to 1798. And that uprising, people still talked about wind as the winds of change and the revolution that was coming. And here's the women using it. When I dressed up as Siobhan McKenna from the Abbey Theatre last week, I put up jokingly on Facebook that I was going to dress up as Con Markovich. And my friend said to me, well, a few of them actually quoted her, what she told the students in UCD, University College Dublin at the time, actually in 1909, she said, dress suitably in short skirts and strong boots, leave your jewels in the bank and buy a revolver. So I don't have a revolver or jewels or anything. I have the strong boots. Next slide. As I said, the mythologizing went on afterwards. If we look at Frank O'Connor, he's an interesting case because he actually joined the revolutionary movement himself. His real name was Michael O'Donovan, and he's from Pat's home place, Cork. And in this story, The Guests of the Nation, he's looking back to the War of Independence, and he was active in that war. In 1931, he produced this great story, and I have a link there where you can read it online. And it's being told by a person that's referred to as Bonaparte. I have to think this is an ironic kind of a name, a reference presumably to Napoleon Bonaparte, but it's got to be a nickname. This fella comes in and tells Bonaparte, I thought you knew we were keeping them as hostages. Who's them? There's a few English troops being kept as hostages in a cottage in the country and looked after by an old woman and a few of the lads fighting on the Irish side. And they've all become friends and they're chatting, and there's arguments breaking out about Marxism and class struggle versus religion. And they've all become friends of sorts, even though they're on different sides. But here, this kind of rural idyll begins to break down because they're having a good time, and it's all terribly symbolic with your Irish cottage and the old woman and all the rest of it. But this fella comes in and says to the narrator, he looked at me for a spell and said, "I thought you knew we were keeping them as hostages." "Hostages," says I, not quite understanding. And this is the viewpoint of a young man who's caught up in the troubles and doesn't quite realize what he's let himself in for. But the enemy, this fella, he says in his heavy way, have prisoners belong to us. And now they talk of shooting them. If they shoot our prisoners, we'll shoot theirs and serve them right. Shoot them, says I, the possibility just beginning to dawn on me. So the implication here is he wouldn't have made friends with them if he thought he was going to be asked to shoot them. And the story is really interesting how it turns on loyalty and friendship versus patriotism, because the English lads are turning around to the Irish fellas that they've made friends with and said, "But we wouldn't shoot you, we've nothing against you." And, you know, that we're on the same side as, you know, it's those in power really that are keeping us all down. So this is Frank O'Connor, if you like, revising history. There's been a lot of complaining about the revisionism of Irish historians, how they're looking back and rewriting history. History is always rewritten all the time. And here you see somebody who was involved in the War of Independence actually thinking back over it himself, that there was nothing that glorious about it, that there were more wars than one going on, and one of them was a class war. Right, next. Somebody else who was creating an alternative narrative is Seán Ó Casey. He's often referred to as a socialist of the slums because he wrote about the very ordinary people of Dublin. It's hard to call them the working class because lots of them weren't working. They were the desperately poor. The Shadow of a Gunman came out in 1923, and this is about revolutionary politics in Dublin. And it's set around Mountjoy Square, where O'Casey himself was living in around the time of the Rising. He knew a lot about poverty. I mean, it's doubtful that he was as badly off as the people he's writing about, but certainly they weren't well off because his father died when he was 6 and he was one of 13 children. But he does depict the desperately poor. It's the lowest kind of tenement life on the streets of Dublin and how they're affected. Juno and the Paycock, 1924, is about the Irish Civil War. And The Plough and the Stars is the one I want to talk about most because it caused the most outrage. It's set in 1916, but you can see there it's written, you know, or came out 10 years after the fact, and caused a riot. Now, not to begin with, but on the fourth night, people caused uproar in the audience. And W.B. Yeats looked back when he saw this uproar happening. What were the riots about? Well, people alleged that it was casting aspersions on the heroes of the Rising, that after they were shot, as Pat says, they became heroes. There was also a prostitute on stage, and she was talking to the lads in the bar. And if there was uproar, I said last week about the Playboy of the Western world, there was uproar over that because it was called a smear on Irish womanhood, because there was a mention of a shift, which is not shift in the kind of courting sense that some of you will know, but a petticoat, a slip. And apparently we weren't supposed to talk about these in public. But people rioted, and here they are rioting again because there's a prostitute on stage when people are talking about the heroes. And W.B. Yeats of the Abbey Theatre came out and roared, we are told, at them, "You have disgraced yourselves again." You know, that they couldn't appreciate the art or the writing or this literary composition. They were just interested in the mythology of pure Irish womanhood, and also the mythology of the heroes of the rising. Right, next slide. I could give you a long list of the books that came out afterwards. I mean, one of the best you should look at is The Last September, was written in 1929 by Elizabeth Bowen, that shows the Anglo-Irish in the gentry side, that they're living in a big house and the war is going on all around them, and they don't really know what's going on. Like, the young woman meets a man out and she's thinking, is it something to do with Ireland? And it's a kind of a romantic notion for her. But you know, they're socializing with the British soldiers and playing tennis and so on. And the house burns down at the end, as indeed lots of houses, lots of those big houses were burnt down in the War of Independence. But if you look at Eilish Dillon, from 1920 to 1994, Eilish Dillon was herself the niece of Joseph Mary Plunkett, so her family were involved. He was a signatory of the 1916 proclamation, and her family, they were certainly better off, and they were landowners. And in these two historical novels, Blood Relations on the War of Independence and The Bitter Glass, which is a much shorter novel on the Civil War, they're very interesting as historical novels. I mean, I don't know that I'd go back and read them twice or anything, but they're certainly worth one read, because when I read them first, I thought they were great in giving an insight into what was going on. But there are places, certainly in Blood Relations, that it becomes kind of tedious. The other thing I found I was struggling with is that, I mean, she's obviously from a better off class herself. So when she talks about people of other classes, like in Blood Relations, she has created this young man called Peter Morrow, and I was less convinced about how she sets them up, whereas the ladies all have delicate ankles and swan-like necks and all the rest of it. The ordinary working people are a lot less glamorous, and she seems to think that they're physically different just because they're from different classes. But she's certainly worth a look. As I said, she comes from a political family. Next slide. Don't look back in anger, a quotation from Oasis, or of course second generation Irish. This is people revising the story later on. Jennifer Johnston has written several really interesting books about the period from a later date. She also is Anglo-Irish, and she's looking back. In a way, she's kind of creating the history of how their side, the Protestant ascendancy, saw the Troubles. And some of her books, like The Old Jest, for instance, show the kind of how the young women of the big houses would view the people, as I said in Bowen's The Last September, would view the young men who were fighting for freedom in a kind of romantic light. How Many Miles to How Many Miles to Babylon is about the World War I, and it's also about the conflict of those who stayed to fight and those who went away to fight in the British Army. They're both really well worth looking at. But what I'm quoting here from is The Invisible Worm. In 1991, she's got a much darker look back on the history. And you've got a young girl called Laura, and she says to her mum, she's only she's about 10 at the time, "Daddy fought for freedom." That's what Daddy says anyway. And her mother says, "Don't you believe it? Daddy fought for Daddy." And her mother is of the Protestant ascendancy heritage. Her father was, it's a mixed marriage, as they used to say. Her father was a hero of Irish independence, is now a politician. But I can't tell you too much about the plot because I really think you should read it. But this is Jennifer Johnston undercutting this idea of a hero. She wasn't the only one to do it. John McGahern in Amongst Women in 1990, and this is a book based around the kind of his family story. And an ex-war hero, the father here, bullies his family and is very hard to live with in civil times, like as a civilian. He's a kind of a terrorist in his own family, and he's running it not like a republic. He's running it sort of like a dictatorship, and he's terrorizing them. He calls the children the troops. And it is that difficulty of like, what do you do once you're a hero? How do you fit into peaceful life later? William Trevor's The Story of Lucy Galt. He was Protestant and, well, you know, he wasn't of the Anglo-Irish landowner class as such, because that was well gone really by the time he came along. The Story of Lucy Galt is about the fallout of the Irish independence, again looking back on it from 2002, and it's quite dark as well, that people are re-examining this history and thinking about how much has been mythologized, and as you know, all this stuff about heroism, and thinking, well, what's the other side of that? And I think the troubles in the north of Ireland had a lot to do with this revisionism, that people are thinking about how it was rewritten to suit a political agenda, which leads us to the next slide, Simon, please. This is Bernard McClaverty, who is himself from the north of Ireland. In 1983, he brought out this really fine short novel, Cal. It was turned into a very good film. And he plays around with ideas of Christ as well. And in some ways, you can see Cal as a kind of an innocent, almost sacrificial victim, though he's not killed. But there certainly are shades of sacrifice here, but done completely differently. He's not dying as a hero. He's just caught up against his own better judgment in what's going on. You've got a character, Skeffington, trying to say to him, you can't just leave the movement now once you've got involved in it. And he quotes Pearse's poem, The Mother, to him. And he says at the end of it, that poem, Cathal, ends with, and yet I have my joy, my sons were faithful and they fought, unlike you, Cathal. And he keeps calling him Cathal and using the Irish version of his name, and Cal, you know, is the shorter name. But Cal says to him, but it's not like 1916. And Skeffington's answer is, it wasn't like 1916 in 1916. Now, Skeffington is using propaganda, and he's telling stories and saying, well, you know, these stories, they mightn't be true, but they do our propaganda, they do our cause a lot of good. And he's, I think, a kind of a latter-day Pearse. This is McClaverty. As I say, he's, you know, he's from the north himself. He's from Belfast. He's now living in Glasgow. Looking back and questioning the way the myths around 1916 have been used in the Troubles in the north. And there's a very symbolic use of an abattoir in that film, or in that book and in the film. They're well worth checking out, both of them. Right, I'm going to end with a Pearse, the next slide, looking at what Frank O'Connor said. He says, looking back, in those days, this is from Guests of the Nation as well, in those days, disunion between brothers seemed to me an awful crime. I knew better after. So the one story that we learned about the Civil War at school is that brother was against brother, and you do see that in the Win the Chicks, the Barley. But what people talked a lot less about is the role of women. So we're coming on to that next week. But I wanted to set up the kind of mythologizing that was going on around these figures before we start undercutting them and seeing, as Pat says, what happens later on. Thank you. So any questions in the Q&A? I see there's one in there already.
Yeah, thanks very much, Deirdre. That was a great roundup of the writing and writers. So we have one question. I don't think we've got very much time, have we?
Oh, no, not too long as usual.
Yeah, so this is a question about Pearse's mental state during the Rising. And I think this is the kind of question that when Deirdre and I grew up, would certainly have got you into trouble if you questioned Pearse's mental state, because he had, I think, as Deirdre said, almost achieved sainthood by then. And I don't know what his mental state was, but I suppose he was in the post office for the whole of Easter week, and he'd never, I'm sure, fired a gun in anger before. And, you know, to go through that, you know, shelling, seeing people being killed around him, I'm sure for somebody who didn't have any military background, would have probably left him with some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder. I don't know whether that's true or not. I mean, the thing that's usually addressed in, I think, when talking about Pearse's mental health is his obsession with martyrdom and blood sacrifice. And he was, I think, obsessed with that. And I mean, you look back on some of his writings today, and he's constantly talking about, you know, the need for blood to be shed and all the rest of it. And it looks shocking today, but if you go back to 1916, this kind of talk was quite common, not only in Ireland, but in Europe as well. John Redmond, for instance, the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, was always going on about the need to shed blood and the nobility of it and all the rest of it. And the fact that blood was being shed in great amounts during the First World War, I think, didn't seem to stop this. But Pearse's mental health, I don't know. He was said to be in a state of almost ecstasy the night before his execution. And I suppose, you know, if he was, if this was the build-up to his whole life, then you can understand that in some sense. And today we know more about, I think, about the, you know, the influence of religion and political ideology on people's mental health. I think there's another couple of questions coming in. Sorry, Deirdre, did you want to say any more about that?
No, you're fine. Yeah, I agree. But, you know, I think looking at the poetry and what happened to Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon and Shell Shock, you know, if Pearse was in a bit of a state, who can blame him? We've got too many questions here. I went on too long again. Sorry, lads. De Valera's absence from the pre-treaty talks a tactical ploy to free himself from responsibility. Well, how do we know? I mean, lots of us think that, but it depends on which side you're on, if you're pro-Dev or if you're sceptical. I don't. What do you think, Pass?
I think De Valera had the knack of getting out of very tricky situations. You know, when the Black and Tan War broke out, De Valera was in America.
Yeah.
And I was away for the whole of that very dangerous period. He returned almost as it was coming to an end. So I'm not a great fan of De Valera, so I have to kind of I have to check myself here.
I'm not challenging you either.
I mean, my opinion is he definitely did this as a tactical ploy. He knew it was going to be compromises were going to have to be made, and he didn't want to be the one to making the compromises.
Yeah, or be seen to make them anyway. And the last question here: the benefit of hindsight, would Home Rule have been any better?
Would Home Rule have been any better? I mean, on a purely kind of legalistic basis, I think what Ireland ended up with in 1922, which was Dominion status, wasn't very far from Home Rule. And I mean, my opinion is, you know, once Home Rule had been given, it could have been built on eventually to get to this Dominion status. I mean, the thing that was always there, of course, is how do you persuade 500,000, or rather 1 million Protestants in the north of Ireland to go along with some form of Home Rule or to go along with some form of independence? I mean, we could have a whole several hours on this alone, I think. I mean, I think the other thing about Home Rule is that, as Dorothy McArdle said, the Republic was such an amorphous thing. It was so many different things to so many different people. And what we ended up with was such a severe disappointment, I think, to so many people. I think some people called it a dictionary republic. It was a republic in name only, even when we got the Republic. So, yeah, would we have been better off with a Home Rule? This is something I probably don't think in the end, no.
Yeah. We're going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry we didn't get around to all your questions. Yeah, Brian is talking about the propaganda of the deed, and indeed, indeed, I didn't mean a pun there, but you know, any war is propagandized afterwards, and people always use it. And well, we're around a Remembrance Sunday now, and how people remember those wars is very different to how they were thinking about them at the time. But thank you very much, everybody, for listening in, for joining in, participating, and we'll see you next week if you want to hear about the women. Of course you do. Oh, don't forget Emmanuel House for donations. Thanks, everybody, and thanks to Five Leaves for hosting, and Simon for doing the slides so efficiently as usual.